I will introduce and invite up to the stage Andrew. He is going to walk us through a conversation on the end user's perspective of software supply chain security. Andrew has 22 years of open source business and strategy related experience. He's launched and sold his own open source startup, Alliance Consulting Group, to Black Duck Software, and worked on many early OEM and ISV strategies. So he's going to help lead us in a conversation today. And do you need the clicker? What do you need? You'll need one of those and then one of those.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I'm inviting a participant up to join me here. So this is Jack Chester, who is a senior software security engineer at Shopify. We won't highlight that. And so what we're going to do today is, as many of you probably are aware, or maybe weren't aware, the OpenSSF in its first incarnation is really primarily a vendor-driven organization. And to some extent, it still has those leanings today. And so that's one of the reasons that John Meadows and I, who's sitting here and also joining the conversation, co-founded the OpenSSF End User Working Group to bring the voice of the end user to the OpenSSF and make sure that it's heard and incorporated into many of the wonderful initiatives that the OpenSSF has. So what we're going to do today is really have a conversation. We'll be reaching out to some of you in the audience. We're going to be just going through we're going to be sharing some of the perspectives of end users around open source software supply chain security. We're going to be, I'm being told to talk a little bit closer to the mic. Okay. We're going to be, we really want to get some feedback from the audience. This is going to help actually feed the content for the end user working group that we're driving here. Today, the end user working group has 30, 40 participants.
Thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere around that number. And many of them are actually end users. We certainly have a number of vendors participating, but we have a lot of wonderful end users who are part of the group, and we want to grow it. So part of this is to actually encourage you to hopefully join once you hear a little bit about what we're talking about. Okay? Can't read that.
For those watching at home, this is really small on our screen.
Yeah. That's better. Now I can almost read it. So what we want to do is set the context a little bit here for the conversation. Right, so today we have producers of software. That's pretty straightforward. What's getting a little bit more complex, actually, is the definition of a consumer of software. The end user working group is focused mainly on consumers of software, but when you look at who the consumers are today, big banks, large financial institutions, manufacturers, telcos, and so on, they're also very significant contributors to open source. So again, the line is blurring between producer and consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about a company, to pick an example from the air completely at random like Shopify, it has a sort of a relationship where it has partly been a consumer. You know, it takes Ruby from the upstream and uses it, but it also has people who work on Ruby. So it's both a consumer and a contributor. And what you find is that this sort of fuzzy relationship, you know, this sort of fuzzy set where you're a bit of one and a bit of another, and there's no hard line that divides it, exists. But you can still look at someone and say, I think they're a consumer, or I think they're a producer, if you want a sort of a shorthand stereotype. And the interests are different.
And the notion of who's a producer and who's a consumer of software or open source specifically is going to become really, really important as there are more and more regulations, such as the EU CRA, which we'll talk a little bit further along. There's also a huge spectrum in the issue around software, open source software supply chain security, right? So you not only have to secure at the source, which is where the OpenSSF is spending a lot of its time, right? Trying to secure open source upstream. But for an end user, they also have to secure at ingestion. And ingestion in a global enterprise today occurs in a myriad number of ways. I'll ask one of our audience participants to maybe share some of their thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I think that's one of the key points that we continue bringing to the group is that when you think about software supply chain from an enterprise perspective, you're at a slightly different place in that supply chain than perhaps other people. And I think one of the things that we could try to focus on is that each participant has that different lens. You're sitting at a different place on that supply chain, whether you're a vendor producing software or open source libraries or an enterprise consuming it. And that's why enterprises have a very different view of that. They're focusing much more on the ingestion of those libraries or those products. And they need to think about, well, where did I get it in the first place? How am I bringing all this software into a company? And some of these concerns are shared amongst a number of different members within the group. It doesn't really matter which industry they're in, they're all sort of shared concerns. So what we are trying to bring together within the group is try to understand what that landscape looks like. We're trying to understand where people sit in that landscape, whether it's the source side or the consumer side. And also trying to think through some of those best practices of, well, this worked in this industry, this worked in the other industry, and try and share some of those approaches. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And before I jump on, I do want to get an understanding, do we have many end users in the audience today? Do we have any primarily consumers of software? A few, okay, a few. All right, so I think this is good to hopefully bring some of the sensitivities and differences and distinctions between the producers and the consumers. So some of the key issues are really for end users today is a lack of awareness and understanding of the issues. Right? They have their own traditional view on what cybersecurity means, but they really don't understand themselves the distinctions between the extra added elements that open source brings or risks that open source brings. There's definitely a clear lack of best practices that are available. The OpenSSF and others are working on rectifying that, but just because we, as in the OpenSSF, create some wonderful training programs, for example, or other awareness programs, doesn't mean that it's actually reaching the end user audience, which today, I can tell you, it isn't yet. Mm-hmm. And then the emerging approaches to this issue. As you've heard from some of the panels before us today, there are a dozen ways to attack this. Some are more efficient than others. Some are oriented more towards producers than they are consumers. So if you are a consumer, just trying to figure out the way you should approach this is a complicated issue by itself.
Oh yeah, it's tough. When I was sort of getting the lay of the land for supply chain security, it was just a blizzard of acronyms and ideas and groups and efforts groping towards each other in the dark. And as a consumer, you don't want that. you don't want that. You want to sort of say like, I got enough going on. So I had a lot of sympathy for folks here. We were talking a few minutes ago, talking about like the burdens of the maintainers, not wanting to add to those. But it's a similar situation for consumers as well. Like we got stuff going on, and the stuff that's going on is not learn things from first principles. So we're in a very confusing environment, very fast-moving environment, and folks who are in the end user perspective desperately need help to make sense of it and to move forward quickly.
So some of the interesting, or I would say slightly scary data points is that over just the last couple of years, we've seen up to a 700% increase in open source software supply chain attacks. Mend.io did an analysis recently and saw over a 300% increase in not vulnerable packages, but actually malicious packages being inserted into some of the package managers. The attackers are rapidly changing their tactics. I don't know if any of you, last year in Austin, I think it was Checkmarks gave a wonderful presentation. I don't know if any of you remember that. Wonderful in how informative it was. They talked about going into the dark web and seeing how many actual commercial entities in the dark web were offering toolkits on how to hack enterprises in particular. And one comment that the presenter made, he said, what was scary about some of these companies in the dark web is they offered a better SLA than we did. So that to me points out some of the scale of the issue. But I think we all know about Log4j. One of the things that stands out for me about Log4j, and I think it was the Harvard census that showed this, is that it was only the 31st most widely used open source component at the time. And I always feel the need to put that in the inverse. So that means that there are 31 more widely distributed open source components to Log4j. Many of them do not have the support infrastructure to essentially operate by secure coding best practices. So there's a lot of issues out there, and all these data points, more of the end users we talk to are unfamiliar with them than they are familiar with them today.
Yeah, Andrew, if I can just add to that. Right?
Yeah, of course.
That's a great point, right? I think often when we come to these great conferences, we're almost in this cool bubble where we're all talking about these really detailed attacks and these great ways we can mitigate these attacks. But when members of the end user working group, we're talking to other people in the industry, we're talking to hundreds of different companies. And what we often find is there isn't that really awareness of what the software supply chain attacks are about. You know, often we'll see feedback like, look, we've got a vulnerability management program. We scan software for vulnerabilities, we're good, right? Or someone asked for an SBOM, so we must be fine, right? It's trying to provide that level of awareness of what the problem statement is, what the threats are, so people are more aware of how to handle those things. And I think that's one of the great things about OSSF. You know, in addition to the end user working group, we've got the education working groups, we've got the Diagrammer Society, which is pretty awesome. Trying to give end users a map to show what the attacks are like, where they're coming from, give them a bit of educational awareness, and then show how they can find out more information about it and where they can focus their energies. Because I think, to your point, Jack, end users have a lot to do, and there's not that many people in CISO in some of these organizations. They're inundated with other things. Supply chain is one of them. And at the moment, we don't quite have some of those capabilities yet that can perhaps mitigate some of those attacks. So what we're trying to do is trying to give them that guidance, give them that map of what to look for, especially since as you're saying, the attacks seem to be changing quite rapidly now.
One of the things we hear from our clients, and some of you may have actually personally experienced this, but as this has gotten more visibility, one of the things we've seen is that teams before that were called DevOps are now called DevSecOps, right? But with no change in resources, no new hires, no training, no experience, all of a sudden those three letters were added to their team's titles. And they're like, uh-oh.
Yeah, basically, solving problems by announcing that you've solved them has a long and storied history, and also a long and storied story of things being sad and people having tears and gnashing and wailing and tearing of garments and so forth.
So open source in some respects is actually a bit of a victim of its success. I think the GitHub Octaverse study that came out this year identified 28 million public repos, almost 100 million software developers just on GitHub alone. That doesn't include the others, right? And if you think about it from an end user perspective, you're beginning, maybe you're a year or two or maybe 5 years on your open source journey, you're beginning to recognize the value, you're consuming more and more open source, and yet you have to sift through these 28 million projects to find out the ones that are actually relevant to you, and that is literally probably 2 or 3% of those 28 million. But if you think about that number, we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of open source projects. Most of those projects have not been developed in a secure by design approach, right? Even the more sophisticated ones. So here you are in enterprise, and if you look at some of the large enterprises, some of the data that we've seen, and some that has been publicly stated is an enterprise will have anywhere between 10 to 20,000 different open source components, right? So it's a big, gnarly problem as they begin to consume more and more and more and more open source.
And that's like 10 to 20,000 different people developing the software. That's 10 to 20,000 different ways of building the software, and different ways that they upload it, and different ways that they release it, and different ways that they secure it. Right now, somewhere in a supply chain, something is going wrong, and do you know about it? Do you know? The answer is no, you don't. You know, it's interesting that men.io figure you mentioned earlier of 300%. To me, that's surprising. That's 300% that we know about.
Yeah. And if we look at something as simple as SBOMs, which is obviously getting more visibility through our efforts, through the media efforts, and so on, another observation we're seeing in our client base is that the engineering organization is telling procurement that when we acquire new software, you must get an SBOM from them.
Yeah, you need them to tick a box on an Excel
It's
spreadsheet.
literally a checked box.
That should fix it.
Yep.
Could you
So
also tick the box that says DevSecOps, please?
we've also seen in the last 5 years, we've seen enterprises being willing to experiment more with early stage software. Almost all of that's built on open source. And that's been a really distinct and interesting trend. So these large global enterprises are beginning to consume more software from early stage startups than they have in the past. And so the problem is, as many of us can recognize, is the SBOM, one, that startup that you just started potentially scaling across the enterprise to run something mission critical, and you just asked them for an SBOM, they probably had to look up what SBOM was first. Second, they had to generate it. And once they generated it, they sent that notification to their clients, and who knows how accurate it is. Mm-hmm. So that's actually becoming more and more common.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the formats. We've thinking about getting to the document. And then the question that came from someone in the audience here earlier today is just like, how do I trust it? You're sort of stuck with this open world assumption that, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You're really sort of struggling. And so SBOMs are a great start. They are strictly better than nothing, but I want more than strictly better.
I think it's a great rallying call to say, look, from an awareness standpoint, you need to ask or you need to look at the software you're ingesting. But, to the point, there's a whole lot more things you need to look at before you trust a product, before you can run it at an end user. And I think, what people are starting to look at now is moving beyond like questionnaires where it's like, well, there's a DevSecOps box and we've asked them if they're secure, so that's a checkbox too. And everyone says, yes, that's good, right? Now moving to some more codified ways of testing that and starting to validate the SBOM, but it's definitely a long way away from what other enterprises are telling us, that's for sure.
And I want to sort of put this back onto those of you who are thinking of maintainers and vendors. Economies are based on trust. They only work because the two people who come to the table to make an agreement or have some sort of exchange or relationship trust each other not to do something bad to some level. If we lose trust in open source, and it could happen, then a whole bunch of things are going to grind to a halt. And it's not going to be pretty. I know that those of you who are involved in CISA probably think about this more than me, but what happens when somebody gets into a water supply system in New York? We're going to have a bad time. Yeah. And that's going to have an effect on open source. The regulators are not going to sit on their hands and go, well, it's open source, and they have a contract that says they disclaim all liability. It's not going to stand up. You got to be ready. You got to help us. Help us, please.
And also putting it in context a little bit, especially when you talk about things like the tool chain. An average enterprise may use 24 different tools in their SDLC process. 24. Maybe SCAs and SAS, and now beginning to look at SBOM generators and all sorts of other tools out there, right? And just trying to, one, create a coherent tool chain, to train the people on the tool chain, to get the outputs and the desired and the results that you're supposed to be getting from it. Managing the tool chains, the tools themselves, and the output is a really, really complex task. Right. Let's move on a little bit. So, the original talk that we had was called Trials, Tribulations, and Triumphs. So I want to talk a little bit about triumphs. Now, that's maybe a little bit of a misleading word. I don't know that we can say we have too many triumphs at this point, but we certainly have some successes. We're on the path to certain successes. And there's one of those, I think an actual success, or something that's going to help us be successful, is the regulation that we're beginning to see. Regulation typically is a pendulum, right? It doesn't exist and then it goes way, 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 way far to the right. Hopefully it begins to come back to the middle. And we're at that stage where we're beginning to see that regulation. whether it's the EU CRA or whether it's the US Fed policies or some others that are floating out there. We're beginning to see it go to the right. But what I've been really pleased at seeing is how open to input and feedback that these regulatory bodies are. They are becoming really collaborative. As we saw from the presentation earlier today, I learned something. I didn't know that was the ONCD was doing all their stuff in the public. Right? They had up on GitHub, I think they said. That's wonderful. So I think that's one of the paths to success, is how collaborative the regulatory bodies are today.
And this sort of plays into the doom and gloom scenario outlined earlier, where something dramatic happens and all the legislatures in the world flip out, as they have done in prior disasters. You got to remember that right now, the delicate thing that keeps open source working is this careful sort of gymnastics act that is required to turn copyright law into open source. That is just law. It can be changed. We need to make sure that the ecosystem is healthy. We want these regulations to be things that we came to over a measured period in a consultative way, maintainers, consumers, everybody. What we don't want is a disaster. So this is a continuing sort of call. Please be involved. Please interact with these agencies as they develop things. Let's develop these policies. Let's set this ecosystem up for success, rather than just like a colossal bang and suddenly everything changed.
There are a number of different emerging processes that we think have some real opportunity to success. And John, you and I had spent some time talking about those. For an organization at your scale, which ones do you think show some real promise here?
Well, I think, that the renewed focus or the conversations around the Sterling toolchain, I think that's going to start to eke some of that work out, right? I think the SALSA as well has been a great sort of approach to identifying some of the issues that you could have at that build stage and how you can secure the infrastructure. Same with SigStore. So I think a lot of the work we are doing at OSSF really does have the ability to benefit end users in large industries as well as small, right? So I think these are emerging successes. I think they really are. We just need to build upon them, and that's why I'm super keen on seeing where we're going to go with the Sterling toolchain and some of the conversations around that. And I think with bringing in regulators and other end users into that conversation, we can hopefully set up that reference blueprint, perhaps, to give them some sort of more guidance on where to go, right? I mean, just saying SALSA 1 is a great start to
Right.
give people that blueprint of what to do within their own infrastructures, right? And then hopefully, and we're seeing it now, vendors are starting to react to that too. So big ones I see are definitely the SALSA element of it. And also, I guess I'll call out the ingestion focus as well. I think, as I said earlier, I think a lot of that focus from an end user perspective is on the ingestion of open source software. And I think there's a number of vendors and capabilities out there now that are looking at identifying malicious open source software as well as the vulnerable software to help end users. And that is really coming on a long, long way over the last couple of years to really get that high signal. It's pretty effective for a mitigation strategy.
Well, I know something that's near and dear to your heart, where we'd really encourage any of the end users who are here in the audience to participate in, is the threat modeling working group, right? You really, if you don't have enough end users participating in helping define the threat models and the taxonomies, then you're missing a big chunk of the equation there. So I know that's something you and your peers spend time on, is really doing threat modeling.
And the risk is that the threat model will wind up looking like what vendors think it is, right? Which, I want to give appreciation to those vendors. I know you all work very hard. I've worked for a vendor, and I worked very hard to understand what the users were doing, but I was not a user. Having been on the other side of the fence, it's like, oh, okay, I see what they were talking about now. I wasn't taking it seriously enough. So we need to make sure, and this goes for those of you who are watching at home, and are end users or consumers, please become involved.
Yep. So there's an organization out there that is focused on one of the only foundations, that's open source foundations, that's focused on vertical industries, and that's FinUS, FinTech Open Source Foundation. And I've been on their board now for a couple of years. And most of my career has been spent in consulting, a lot of it on the vendor side, but now I'm getting used to these regulatory and standards bodies, terms like ISDA, ICMA, ECMA, and all these other MAs. It just points out that if you come from that end user, that consumer space, when we in open source, when we talk about compliance, we think of licensing and IP traditionally. When an end user in a highly regulated industry like financial services or healthcare, when they say the word compliance, it means something totally different and add an order of magnitude of complexity to what we think about when we think about compliance. So again, just wanted to share a little bit of some of the additional layers of complexity that an end user has that's a little bit distinct from what a vendor does. So if we think about the way forward here, there is an opportunity right now. A lot of it is being coalesced through the OpenSSF and other bodies out there. There's also opportunities to work directly with some of these government agencies and regulatory bodies like CISA and others. And then there are some great working groups in the OpenSSF that end users' voice have to be heard. It's really important. Some of those are, we've mentioned already, SBOMs everywhere, threat modeling. CISA is a body that's really open to working with industry and end users, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really impressed with the work that's come out of CISA. I was really impressed by the cybersecurity policy that came out a few months ago. Obviously, I don't want to be too US-centric. I know that we have folks from all over the world here. I want to encourage you to also be involved with your governments in your countries. Find out who the responsible body is. If there isn't a responsible body, interrogate government. Find your legislators. ask them why not.
I think we've got just a couple of minutes left. We'd definitely like to leave it open for any questions.
Just like Amir, I think we were too good.
Mike. No.
So just for the record, the CRA is a clear and present danger to the entire open source ecosystem, and I will fight anybody who says otherwise.
Mike, I think you may have misheard that. We can get the tape because I agree with you. Yes. What I actually said was that they are actively seeking industry input on the CRA.
So for those watching at home, there's a debate breaking out about what we said about the CRA. For those who don't realize or don't know what that is, it's the Cyber Resilience Act that's being mooted in the EU. It potentially has very positive impacts in terms of encouraging manufacturers, distributors, and importers to make sure that their products are safe. But of course, it could also be read in a way that it means it also affects creators of open source software, distributors of open source software. I can't use the present tense anymore. I was pushing very hard at the previous employer to be vocal about the potential impacts on open source. And I think we can all agree that that's something that we're concerned about. I think the point here was that there has been options to give feedback, and I think I've definitely pushed continuously making feedback. We'll just have to see how that
the
shakes
issue
out.
is that at this point, feedback is in a political process. So the opportunity to influence the impact of the legislation before it was first published was long gone, and none of the open source community was involved in that process. It was completely opaque and in a closed room, and now we are fighting tooth and nail through a legislative process by talking to members of European Parliament and delegations to the Council. And anybody who cares about open source needs to understand that this is a battle royale at this point, and unfortunately, it's political. It's not. We are no longer in the realm of providing input in the normal sense. And by the way, I would actually agree that in many cases, the U.S. organizations that you cited have been much more open to dialogue and input, to their credit.
So just for the record, want to make sure, not saying that CRA is a good potential law, but, and I'm sorry to hear you say, and I know you've spent a ton of time on this, Mike, so I'll take your word at it, that there's not much opportunity anymore for input. So that's disappointing.
That being said, if you're in Europe, contact your MEP right away.
All right, so we do have to wrap it up. Any last question here? I hope what we've done today is just kind of share a little bit of the differences between how the concerns, questions, complexities that end users experience. It's a little bit different than what most of us as vendors do experience. So thank you for your time.